I'm Dr. Mark Gold, and this is the Gold Standard. So, what can I say? I'm really delighted to have Dr. Josh Siegel here at the Gold Standard to talk about his career and work in the future. And it's such a pleasure. Welcome.
Pleasure to be here. Nice to see you, Mark.
It's good to see you. Happy Monday, too. Anyway, let's go back and just give people an idea about how you get to be where you are as one of the world's leaders in psychedelic research. You started as an undergraduate at WashU, I think.
That's right.
Because I did too.
I know.
So I know it's wild. And so you came from high school to WashU, and you basically, like, what was your major? I mean, mine was English.
In undergrad,
Yeah.
it was they had this great major called philosophy, neuroscience, psychology. It was like
Huh.
interdisciplinary thing.
So that's pretty interesting. And then, like,
Yeah.
did that prepare you enough to go to medical school?
Well, actually, I remember like I was really into philosophy and so I was excited about it. And then when I got there, I was in these philosophy classes, which were kind of fun, but then I really sort of craved more hard science. I remember thinking, oh, we can stay up at night debating this philosophy. I want like experimental empirical science. And so that was, so I remember having that strong drive. Although now I think, probably a lot of the philosophy and psychology really has benefited me in my as my career has progressed.
Yeah, me too. That's kind of why I brought it up, is because when you do think about translational researchers, and, in my career, I was the chief when Dennis Charney came through Yale, and John Crystal often says I inspired him to come to Yale, and Eric Nestler,
Some
and
incredible
so
folks
forth.
there. I mean, it's
Really,
no WashU, but there's some incredible folks.
yeah. But I
Yeah.
mean, but I don't think they learn. I mean, I think Dennis's resilience was really due to Steve Southwick and Dennis's own hard work in the field to learn it. But you benefited because here you got an MD and a PhD, and so your undergraduate work, I think, has influenced your career and
Absolutely.
separates you from other scientists.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely.
Yeah. So, was there a favorite philosopher that you could think of, or a favorite philosophical argument that you might have?
Well, the thing that I always still use in talks every time is there's this Churchland Sejnowski 1992 paper where they talk about the and I have to give credit also to my like advisor Carl Craver who showed me this stuff and was awesome. But they talk about the levels of neuroscience and they kind of explore how you can look at molecules and neurotransmitters and chemicals, and you can look at the mind and psychology and behavior, and everything in between all has to fit together. And part of the job of neuroscience is that often sort of is the harder job than actually making the scientific discoveries, is figuring out how these different levels from the cellular to the systems and circuits to the mind fit together. So that was one thing that I think really stuck with me is there's the sort of there's the progressing on the frontier of science, but then there's also the integrating across the levels of how we understand and think about the brain.
Well, we'll get back to that when we think about, like, the Siegel hypothesis on how psilocybin and psychedelics might work, which I call it the Siegel
Yeah.
hypothesis.
Don't give me anything eponymous yet. I'm
Okay.
too young for
Well, I know.
that.
We're not just calling you Josh, but yes, it's fine. But it is a highly referenced paper for that reason. Anyway, so I bring this up in part because what went wrong with psychedelics the last time, and I remember it very well because that's my era in science and at Woodstock.
I
as a
remember
med.
it too because I read the electric acid test.
Yeah, well, that's a fact. And if you look at the podcast here, David Smith talks about that because Ken was at the Haight-Ashbury and was a friend and supporter of the clinic. But see, you have Timothy
I know,
Leary.
Dave. I'll have to check it out.
You should. Yeah. I mean, I say it, but I even went back and looked at it and thought, oh my God, he had so many interesting things.
Dr. Dave. He always
Yeah, Dr. Dave is what a classic. So you had Richard Alpert, who has a PhD in psychology, and so he was the head of the Harvard psilocybin project. And Timothy Leary, who's also a psychologist, came to lecture at Harvard and stayed. And the two of them ended up getting fired in 1963. But before that, they had a series of misadventures in science, which, what was it, tune in? What was it? The saying?
Turn
Turn
in, turn
on.
on, and drop out.
Yeah, that was it. So it was really the use of psychedelics as part of uh, a movement of some kind rather
Yeah,
than a therapy.
right.
And then the reason they were fired was not really to do with psychedelics per se, was due to ethical and experimental code violations. Is that the way you understand it too?
I mean, as you said, you would know this stuff better than me, but yeah, I think that's right. And it is, obviously I don't have the firsthand experience of that saga, but it is something I think about, all the time as I sort of just behold mostly the larger like psychedelics, renaissance as they call it, and what's happened with MAPS and MDMA in some ways is sort of has similar flavor to that, right? Because it's not necessarily the science that was the problem. It was it was what are the ethics, what's going on, how are the trials being run, what are the biases and what's happening outside of the lab.
No, I'm saying that only because, like, there's always the risk, and I know this from my friends who pioneered ketamine, that club use and self experimentation will make it exceedingly difficult for us to develop new uses for these medications and then to get them approved. So knowing the past is really
Certainly
key.
complicates things. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, we could start with that if you like. The MDMA seemed for a long time, and I'm sure I was quoted the last time you and I had a meeting in Miami. I was pretty sure that MDMA would be approved for PTSD or trauma. It was so close, and we didn't see the intricacies of the trial, but it seemed like that would be next up. Right now, I'd say psilocybin is next up. But
Yeah.
what went wrong with MDMA?
Yeah. Well, I mean, as I understand it, the issues were not with the outcome. There was what you want, two positive, large phase 3 pivotal trials of MDMA for PTSD, and they were both, pretty large effect, and there was substantial benefit. And that was I mean, this is sort of a side note, but it's a very intensive regimen. I would think it was 4 doses of MDMA and like 13 therapy sessions. So not the most, not for the faint of heart, not a easy protocol. But regardless of that, it was, they were both positive compared to placebo. But it ended up being sort of, what's the expression like death by 1,000 needles?
Cuts. Yeah, yeah.
Something
No,
like that,
needle.
right?
Yeah, yeah.
Because it was like, there was concerns about, minimizing suicidal ideations that emerged. There was concerns about bias on the part of some of the
Meaning,
facilitators or therapists. There was, one or two cases of inappropriate contact or relationship between therapists, and it was just the accumulation of those things, and then, in the obviously setting of being under very high scrutiny in the first place, because this is,
the first.
yeah, the first major psychedelic that was being sort of considered for FDA approval, and it was, the FDA put together this special commission for, advisory panel, and that's when things started. And there was a concerted effort, actually, by many individuals to raise these concerns for, I think, mostly sort of reasonable, motives. It's not as if there was necessarily like nefarious motives, but it just ended up being that there was enough concern about how the trials were conducted that the advisory panel advised against approval, and then the FDA followed suit.
Yeah, it was surprising from the outside, just
It was, yeah.
how, and it's overwhelming disapproval. And the post analyses with discussions and leaks of called into question a lot of the field.
Yeah.
And in many ways, the WashU group and the study showing mechanism for psilocybin helped reassert science and convince people. I mean, you made page one of the New York Times, for God's sake.
Well, that was great. That was great, and study to be a part of. And if it is at all use in the sort of consideration of psychedelics, then that's awesome. I do want to say before we turn to that, I always think about this in the context of what happened with MAPS and Lycos and MDMA, that, I just moved from WashU to NYU a year ago. And one of the things that drew me, and I have to say, I consider myself a neuroscientist,
Sure.
and I think very deeply and carefully about neuroscience. I don't consider myself a clinical trialist, and certainly, Ginger Nickel and her study coordinators will tell you that they're the ones who had to keep me in line and make sure that I was, documenting everything and dotting every I and crossing every T, because anytime you're doing psychedelics research, you have the DEA, you have the FDA, you have the state, Bureau of Narcotics, you have the IRB, all sort of breathing down your neck. So the point I'm making is that the two guys who are sort of started the center at NYU, which is Michael Bogenschutz and Stephen
Sure.
Ross. One of the things I really liked when I came and interviewed here is that they're just incredibly careful. I liked it because it complemented maybe my weaknesses, I'll say, but they're extraordinarily careful and objective and not only meticulous, but also just really like, they're not in it for publicity, or they're not in it to prove a point. They're in it to do rigorous empirical science. And I think, if we are going to go on a different course from how the sort of first wave of psychedelics research went, I think that's the way to do it, to me. So
Yeah. No, to stick with that theme for a little bit, one of the other things that came up with the FDA discussion was the discussion about controls and placebo and active placebo. And
yeah.
you seem to have learned from that too by adopting a dosing strategy. Is that correct? Using just basically doing dose response and saying that's as good a placebo as you're going to get in this field.
I think that's probably been the most successful and, to me, the best strategy. I mean, in terms of just to sort of set the point, you do these studies with psychedelics, and if you give people a, sugar pill placebo or niacin or even dextromethorphan has been used, and sometimes like 1 milligram of, so like basically a microdose or even a, smaller microdose. And 90+% of people correctly guess what they got. So you have unblinding, and then you combine that with the bias of people who are seeking out these trials, the bias of facilitators who are with them during the, doing preparation and integration. And the result is that you can call into question the integrity of the trial results, because there's this, bias phenomenon. And so I do think, having ascending doses has been one way of starting to get past that. The phase 2 Compass. So Compass is the company that is the furthest along towards FDA approval of psilocybin, and with USONA Institute being pretty close behind them. But they had a large phase 2 trial where they had 1 milligram, 10 milligrams, and 25 milligrams. And they did show, pretty substantial separation between 10 milligrams. And this is, by the way, synthetic psilocybin,
Right.
pure psilocybin. So it's, equivalent to, I think estimates, are debated, but a large dose, a full dose, somewhere in 3 to 5 grams of psilocybin mushrooms with the 25 milligram dose. And anyways, my point being that there was big separation with the 10 milligram dose. And I do think the 10 milligram dose is a much better blind. People don't, they generally, in my experience, either think they got a full dose or don't know if they got, 25 or 10. So that's probably the most compelling thing I've seen so far.
Yeah, and major depressive disorder, treatment resistant.
Yes,
Major.
sorry, I'm not giving all the proper context, but that's right. That was the largest treatment-resistant depression psilocybin clinical study to date. Yeah.
Yeah, and it established, in essence, a dose response, and it established a dose that appears equal to a higher dose, so therefore would be less risky. Is that the way you would look at it?
The highest dose they had in that study was
It was
25
25. Yeah.
milligrams, and there had already been some studies sort of showing that you go any higher than that, you don't really seem to get further benefit. People get more disoriented and you have more side effects. But yeah, they
So,
showed that the 25 was very effective and much more effective than 10 or 1 milligrams, which was the other arms.
and then so it is just coincidental that here we are. We scheduled this in advance, and I'm sitting around doing my weekend reading for the holiday, and the July 5th Wall Street Journal headline says, "The Maha movement loves psychedelics."
Yeah.
Did you happen to see that article?
I haven't. I've heard, I saw something on social media about RFK saying that what he wants to have psychedelics available in a
It,
year, something
it
like
was
that.
yeah, it was both RFK and the presumptive Surgeon General pick, Casey Means.
Yeah.
Both said that it's one of the most important new therapies, and there'll be strong political backing to get agents approved. But
Well,
I mean, I think it just, to me, that just showed that the rest of the science has overcome the MDMA debacle.
yeah. Certainly it hasn't derailed the, development of psilocybin and other psychedelics. And maybe it's worth pointing out, I mean, I use this sort of scientific definition, and MDMA is not a psychedelic
Yes, it's
in the
true.
first place, which isn't to say that it's not potentially effective for PTSD, but
No,
I view it as a
I'm with
different
you.
thing.
Yeah. Okay, so a lot of your work revolves around these concepts like default mode network, which,
Yeah.
which in a group of psychiatrists might be a they might not have learned a lot about this in medical school. So when you think about your your the paper in Nature and mechanisms, the could you just go through the paper, go through the mechanisms, and keep in mind that most of the viewers will be psychiatrists and might not be trained in neuroanatomy or neurophysiology.
Sure. I think, first of all, I think I was at a more general conference recently, and I asked the audience, like, how many people have heard of the default mode network? And I think 70% of people raise their hands. So I am impressed how much it's sort of come
Hold
in
on.
the common knowledge, right? Which is cool. And WashU, I think, does get to take a lot of credit. Folks there, Mark Rakel and folks really discovered and built out this, our understanding of the default mode network, which in a very short summary is a system of brain areas that is related to the sense of self, I think it's fair to say, and it's actually more active during sort of introspection, and then less active when you have somebody doing a task in the scanner that requires external attention. So it's in this antagonistic relationship with task, with like attention systems and systems related to the external world, and that's been it. And it turns out that it's probably centrally important to many psychiatric illnesses, not the least of which, mood disorders and anxiety disorders. Um, and and so there was, I was not the first person to suggest that there was some importance with psychedelics affecting the default mode network. In fact, I believe that there was mention of it in Michael Pollan's book,
Yes,
Change
there
Your Mind.
was. There was.
Yeah. So, the but what we did in our study at WashU is we took a relatively small number of individuals, just 7 participants, and we have, WashU has really been a pioneer with brain imaging, and the sort of most recent page of that story is this idea of what's called precision functional mapping, which is individually mapping networks very precisely in a single person's brain. And ends up being extremely valuable for a number of reasons, but the main reason is that there's just so much variability, between people, that when you start averaging brains together, it just doesn't end up working that well. And so you can see things at a much higher resolution and detail by using this precision functional mapping approach. So we took 7 people, did precision functional mapping, and then had them do this sort of intensive protocol where they would come in. They came in for, I think, an average of 18 visits, and they had baseline, and then psilocybin, and then methylphenidate, which is Ritalin, and then they came back later for a second high dose of psilocybin and imaging during drug and after drug, and the goal was to really carefully sort of understand the story of both what brain areas and networks are affected by the drug, how are they affected afterwards, in the days, 2 weeks afterwards. And so there was a couple, I think, valuable insights from that. One that, as I've been referencing, is that the default mode network is really centrally a part of this sort of unique psychedelic effect of ego dissolution, and the sort of acute experience of we use this thing called the mystical experience questionnaire, which has this sense of connectedness with people or objects or individuals around you, and this sense of often sort of awe or mystical experience, and various other components of the psychedelic experience pretty strongly correlated with disruption in the default mode network. And then the other piece of the story that really ended up being central to that study is that when you ask what's actually going on with the default mode network, when you're normally, in normal circumstances, like I described, either, you're sort of daydreaming, introspection, you're walking around, making coffee, whatever, doing a task. In either case, this collection of brain areas is highly synchronized. And whether it's more active or less active, it's obviously composed of millions of neurons, hundreds of millions, and they're generally sort of, an orchestra firing in synchrony. And then when you give a psychedelic, they desynchronize. And the nice thing about, I mean, we showed this with fMRI on the sort of larger scale, but the nice thing about the observation is, even if you look, you do single unit recording, you can see that where under normal conditions, a single neuron will be firing whenever the local field is in the active state. And then on a psychedelic, it's just sort of firing on its own and out of sync with the local field. And that seems to be central to what creates this very unique sort of disruption of change of consciousness, disruption of ego. So that's the sort of central telling of that story.
So you see that with the 25 milligrams of psilocybin.
Yeah, we saw it, and then, not at all with methylphenidate. In fact, if anything, maybe sort of the opposite.
Opposite. Yeah, which I think was a great finding all by itself. I mean, for people who need methylphenidate anyway.
Yeah.
So the and then you're a psychiatrist, so what's the use for that? Is it to train clergy, or maybe it is to train clergy? Maybe it is to provide mystical experiences, but independent, looking at the disease states you might be able to treat. You could treat depression. Not necessarily. Does it have to be treatment-resistant depression, or is it just that it's the ketamine following that model of approval?
That altered, whatever is changing acutely is triggering a lasting plasticity. And so there seems to be, I use the term plasticity broadly. You could talk about it again at the sort of molecular up to the psychological level, but there seems to be more sort of a sort of window where there's more adaptability and flexibility, and that is clinically useful. We know the neurotrophic hypothesis is that the sort of idea that plasticity, that stress and depression is a state of atrophy and sort of rigidity, and antidepressants often work by increasing the plasticity of the system, which, at the very least, you could say enables change and enables the change of, maladaptive patterns, right? So, and that's why I think that is to some degree, obviously we're talking generalities, and I'm not even talking about specific parts of the brain, but that is to some degree why ketamine and also psychedelics are, and frankly SSRIs are transdiagnostic, right? Because this is a mechanism that in addiction, in mood disorders, the goal is to change maladaptive patterns, right?
Even though you didn't study this and report it in the Nature article, would it be your thesis that all psychedelics worked in this manner? The psilocybin worked identifying a common mechanism for psychedelic medicine?
Well, yes. I mean, one of the things that's been really, I think, is interesting is you have now like DMT, which lasts for about 10 minutes. And you have people are interested in, LSD effects are 10 hours. People are interested in drugs like Ibogaine, which I understand is even longer than that. And so, and surely you can't necessarily expect that the effect of a 10-minute psychedelic dose would be the same as a psilocybin, which is somewhere in the middle in the maybe 4 to 6 hours range. So there's Gould Dolan, who I think is at Berkeley now, has this nice paper in Nature where they show in a preclinical model that the duration of the psychedelic, and they include ketamine in there as well, seems to predict how long you have this window of flexibility afterwards. So, and that's consistent with, I mean, I was actually involved with some ketamine research prior to getting into psychedelics, and we had this crazy protocol. I don't know if you were familiar with it, but it was a 96-hour ketamine like sub-anesthetic ketamine infusion, which came from this same observation that you can have months of antidepressant sort of, or remission from depression by giving a much longer infusion. So my inkling is that there is, an important relationship between how long the drug is lasting and how long these benefits last for. But there's certainly, a lot more exploration to be done on that front.
Yeah, because I think, like you mentioned DMT, and it reminded me that there was just a recent paper on that, maybe with a nasal spray. Am I right? Or
I don't know.
like, isn't that like from the toad?
Well, that's 5-MeO
Oh,
DMT,
yeah, but
which
that's it. Yeah,
I think maybe, yeah, I remember seeing something about a nasal spray with that, but I think they're pretty close relatives.
yes,
And yeah, there's all the thing. I don't know. Couldn't tell you exactly not mechanisms, but routes of delivery of each of these.
yeah.
So I
But
do know that DMT vaping is increasingly a recreational thing.
yeah, so I think DMT has it's far behind psilocybin. It's the phase one, but I think they're positive
Yeah.
phase one nasal spray findings reported over the weekend. And
Oh.
so anyway, so let's go back to psilocybin.
There's this very nice, so Psychedelic Alpha uh,
Hmm.
is a website that's been sort of keeping track of the development of psychedelics, the pharmaceutical development, and they have a nice target diagram where they show all the companies and all the compounds that are in preclinical development in phase one, two, and three. And it's just astounding. I think, the last number I heard, which is maybe even more than this now, was 150 new molecular entities that are classified as psychedelics that are in development by pharma, which is just mind blowing.
Yeah, I mean that's a separate question, which is how that works. I mean, if you've established a dose for psilocybin, and people can get psilocybin mushrooms, how could there be a pharma market for that?
Yeah, yeah. These are big questions. I don't know where things are going to go. You have all these converging forces from and then you have on the other side, you have like decriminalization and
Right.
increased recreational access and use. And so it's an interesting time.
Yeah, there is. I mean, because there is animals won't self-administer psilocybin, so you don't have the addiction liability in the same way. But there are some behavioral addiction aspects.
There's that, and also, and you can hear the expert on addiction, so you can tell me if I'm wrong, but I agree that in terms of, recreation or like addictive potential, it's less than ketamine, and the risk, and there's also not a lot of lethal, at least with psilocybin and LSD, not a lot of like risk of overdosing, and dying. But there is one of the things that's been of interest and people are trying to get a more clear handle on is this sort of the broad class of, hallucinogen persisting perceptual disorder, emergence of psychosis, and how does it compare to marijuana, which, there was a whole sort of saga of increasingly realizing that there's this pretty substantial psychosis risk, right? Sort of after the fact of many states decriminalizing and legalizing it.
Yeah, and not supporting doubling of schizophrenia rates with
Great.
comparable hospitalization coverage. But yeah, it's so that just let's go back to the FDA again and think this through. What's the time frame, do you think? Either in that newsletter you talked about, Alpha, whatever,
Oh yeah, psychedelic alpha.
psychedelic Alpha. What do they say? Where's psilocybin in the process for
Well,
treatment-resistant
yeah.
depression?
So Compass just announced the results of their first phase 3 study. They have another one that's, I think, still enrolling. It's supposed to report results in something like a year. And as I said, they're the lead. And so the estimate that I have heard that seems reasonable is as early as, early as the first half of 2027. So about 2 years from now, maybe a year to get the trial, those second pivotal trial results, and then a year for, the new drug application. You could see the approval of psilocybin. So that's
Now, do you need to have therapy? Like, is it just taking the drug like on the street corner, or do you need
Well, it
integration
definitely, yeah, and
therapist?
I don't know how the FDA is going to rule about that. They say over and over again, we don't regulate therapy,
Right.
but Compass has come down on I would say, relatively towards the minimal therapy side, but still they require a couple hours of preparation and then, oversight during the dosing by think, certainly for their trials, it's by a trained therapist and then some integration sessions afterwards, which, I think, I mean, we can talk more about that, but there's good reason for wanting to have those safeguards and that structure. And then just as a contrast, USONA, which is relatively close behind Compass, has come down, actually is substantially more intensive in the psychotherapy component. They require two facilitators. They require, something like 6 hours of preparation, and then two facilitators present throughout the dose, and then 4 or 6 hours of integration afterwards, which is, not trivial. But how that's going to shake out in terms of FDA ruling, how it's going to shake out in terms of clinical implementation, I don't know.
Well, I mean, and in the marketplace, I mean, if you can just be in a state where you can buy it and take it, are you
Yeah.
going to be better off or worse off than a person who will take it under supervision by a psychiatrist in a clinical protocol that shows an outcome? I mean, the Compass Pathways study, there was this big discussion about the acute outcome and how many MADRS points
Yeah.
they expected a 5 and they got a 3.6 or something. Could you just, was it a strongly positive phase 3 study, or is it a phase positive phase 3 barely?
It was clearly significant, whatever P of point less than 0.0001. I think it was 3 point, was it 6 or 8 points on MADRS. And that was at the other thing I think that's important, that like I've seen some of these, stories pop up about it. They leave out that this is 6 weeks after the dose. So we're talking
From
about,
one dose, right?
yeah, taking one pill and then a month and a half later, somebody asks how you're doing. And so, I mean, and that's a long time, right? And actually, a lot of the trials that have had larger responses, the primary endpoint has been 3 weeks. So not only a long time, but longer than in some of the prior trials. So I view it as expected. The other maybe thing to keep in mind from my small career in pharma, I know that drugs always have a smaller effect in phase 3, and
That's not.
you have a more diverse patient population. And I think it's a good thing. I mean, you have a more diverse patient population, more diverse clinical sites that aren't usually a larger placebo response, because you have all these. This is not a good thing, but all these contract research organizations that are, paid to bring in people to do your trial, to your study, and sometimes the quality of the participants in the study goes down. So, I mean, this is like,
It seemed positive to me because it was, again, it
yeah,
was a 25 milligram dose,
yeah.
and they got a significant effect. There's no doubt about it in a phase 3 trial. Now, the other thing that's out there that is of interest to me was I think they presented at Psychedelic Science 2025 a 5-year follow-up. Is that buzzing around that they actually have 5-year follow-up after a single dose data? That
I
they
had not
haven't
heard that.
they haven't presented it, but they whispered it.
I missed that.
That's fine.
I
So
mean,
that's a
there's Hopkins studies that uh, have reported like more than a year follow-up, but even like, I don't put too much stock in that.
That's fine. But
I'm
so
skeptical, even not to name names, but like the studies reporting that there's benefit over a year later.
right.
Uh, is it possible? Sure, maybe it's possible, but it's also same
Unlikely.
thing we've talked about before, which is the sort of bias that you were in a psychedelic trial and you know which drug you wanted, and many of the people who are enrolling in these trials and the facilitators have a bias, and so I take it with a grain of salt.
Yeah, well, we had the same thing at Yale when we were studying cocaine. Keep in mind, cocaine wasn't considered addicting at the time. It wasn't really a drug. It was like champagne. And we compared cocaine to lidocaine. And in a study that proved to me how important set and setting are. So in the Payne Whitney gym, people couldn't really tell the difference between a very small dose of cocaine and local anesthetic. Um, Now, so psilocybin's making great progress. You don't expect it to last forever, a single dose. There'll be multiple doses, and that there'll likely be some psychotherapy that will make it more effective than just taking it. So there are risks to psilocybin, club risks, like in club settings, and some of the NYU guys have reported this psilocybin is often taken with MDMA. I think they call it candy flipping.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I've heard hippie flipping.
And the hippie flipping is, I think,
Is that
MDMA and
different? Oh, okay, okay.
hippie flipping is MDMA and LSD.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, whatever it is, there more toxicity, of course,
Yeah.
and they take the LSD first, and then of course, it lasts too long, and they're used to MDMA's window. But those are all risks. But let me just ask a general psychedelic science question. For LSD, that seems close behind for GAD. Like if you were to think about treatment-resistant depression, we could get all the way to the end with psilocybin, and then in comparable efficacy, it might not have any advantages over the uh, uh, ketamine. Is that possible?
I don't know there hasn't been direct comparison between ketamine and psilocybin. There is this suggestion both from
And the same,
animal.
there hasn't been comparison to TMS because you at WashU WashU does TMS, they do VNS, they do ketamine, and if you think
Yeah.
of the algorithm for treatment resistant depression, it's unclear where it fits. On the other hand, GAD, what do you got other than LSD on the horizon?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and I think the trials with LSD for GAD, I think they're in phase 3 at this
They're
point.
in phase 3
Yeah.
was planned for 2025, and I don't know whether they're enrolling. I assume they are. So in my list, I've always had that. When you and I first met, that was third on my list. So I mean,
Mhm.
I was pretty sure MDA would make it because, like, what else do we got for PTSD? For God's
Yeah.
sakes!
Well, yeah. Yeah.
And the same now is for GAD. So I
Yeah.
think this just it's
I I will say that just to back to the point about ketamine, I think there hasn't been direct comparison, but there's certainly compelling evidence that psilocybin or LSD have longer lasting effects than ketamine. You don't see this sort of one week relapse rate that you do with ketamine. What's the story with GAD? Is there really any special benefit of LSD compared to psilocybin? I'm skeptical. I don't know. Um, I think MindMed that has been at the forefront with GAD for anxiety, they've taken an even more, as far as I understand, minimal psychotherapy approach, and they've done relatively well. I mean, I think that, frankly, my impression has been that the psychotherapy piece is as much for reducing risks, psychological risks specifically, as it is for increasing benefit. So that's one thing I worry about with these very minimal approaches. Uh, so we'll see what happens with that. Is that there's somewhat higher risk of suicide or of whatever um, adverse outcomes. Um, so we'll see how the phase 3 goes for MindMed.
well, if you looked at ketamine, right? The FDA asked if you use Spravato that people stay under observation, what, for 2 hours?
Yeah.
What would you assume for psilocybin?
Well, acutely, I think 6 hours minimum. And then, but I think as far as how do we make this like practical so you don't have two therapists putting a whole day into treatment, I'm really interested in group treatment setups, which, I mean, you look at how psychedelics have been used in these veteran communities and in retreats and in indigenous use. It's typically in a group setting. So that's one
Mm-hmm.
thing, is that there's probably ways to get a lot more to scale up and be a lot more efficient with group treatments. Uh, and then, uh, and then, in addition to the 6 hours, I think some degree of integration is crucial uh, because, and the data bear this out, that there can be destabilizing effects,
Sure.
psychologically destabilizing effects of the drug, and having a therapist who you trust to sort of work through the experience and figure out how you're going to integrate any lessons learned, or cope with a bad trip or challenging experiences that you had. It can make a big difference in terms of can even turn a negative experience into something that was therapeutically useful. So I think it's, you know, yes, it's resource intensive, but at least some degree of, I think the psychotherapy is valuable.
Yeah, and the group I was just trying to get you just reminded me when you said, well, psilocybin might be just as good for GAD as LSD, but you wouldn't have to watch people for 24 hours. Or what would be the watch period for LSD versus psilocybin?
Yeah, it seems to be 3 or 4 hours long, probably 4 hours longer. So 10 to 12 hours with LSD. Generally, people are still altered enough that you want to keep them supervised. So it is, I mean, and, and then the sort of what can we fit into a 9 to 5 workday, that 4 hours could make a big difference.
Well, you said retreats or some
Yeah,
novel
yeah,
approaches. Once you get something approved, we can work on the treatment delivery. So,
yeah.
like,
Big question though.
I don't want to keep you forever, but if you had if the audience is looking forward to psychedelic medicine, and we covered ibogaine and DMT, 5-MeO DMT, and we covered psilocybin, and we covered LSD. Um, and is there anything we missed?
Well,
Oh wait, I know what I missed. Like, do you need to hallucinate? Do you need the
oh,
you
that's a
need
good one. That's a good
yeah,
one.
because like pharma, one thing pharma could give us is psychedelic without hallucinations.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm very excited to find out. There's at this point really just preclinical data. So we don't know the answer yet. And this whole group of non-hallucinogenic psychedelic analogs, which is the idea that you can have this sort of afterglow and flexibility without having a intense psychoactive experience. Uh, it's intriguing. I mean, of course, it's clinically of interest for anybody who can't tolerate a psychedelic or is not interested. And it's also, to me, scientifically of interest, just frankly, as a tool to understand, sort of dissociate or differentiate, maybe dissociate is a fraught word. Dissociate the acute drug effects from the lasting effects, to answer some important questions about what is causing the clinical benefit. So I'm very excited. I think that's another thing that in the next year or two, you'll start to get some really good answers emerging.
Yeah, I like that. I mean, I think that's good for the audience. Also, these treatments in the history of psychiatry, and I remember this myself when lithium came to market, and it was like so radical, and psychiatrists used to take it themselves. Is there a and Dr. Dave had his own day in the Haight-Ashbury. Is it something that the person will need lived experience as well as MD, PhD, or academic experience? Or could you be like me and be an addiction expert without ever having been an addict?
I really don't. Yeah, that's a good question. And opinions vary. And I kind of I don't know where my opinion is. Like I can't give you a good scientific rationale for it. I kind of feel like, by the way, that to be a really good like acute addiction counselor, it probably helps to have had some personal experience with addiction. As far as psychedelic therapy, maybe. I think you can certainly be a qualified therapist and monitor and support somebody through their experience without having taken a psychedelic. But it's possible that it would give you a little additional insight into what they're experiencing. So I'll punt on that one.
Okay, I was running out of time. I wanted to save the hardest question for last, but it comes up all the time in my career. Like, how can you
Yeah.
be, such an addiction expert, never being an addict? And I said, well, I don't know. I mean, I rescued so many, but
Yeah.
it's but the best addiction practitioners at the front line that I've trained are recovering doctors.
That's been my observation is that, yeah, the
But you
particular.
have to train them because
Right.
they're
Right.
only a case study of one.
Yes. Uh, Particularly for a therapist or, the people who are on the front line meeting somebody where they're at. So an interesting question as as the psychedelic renaissance continues to grow.
So I appreciate you taking the time with us. Hatherley's been important for me. You met Andrew, and his father, Fred, was the founder of it, and I was his first like addiction expert friend. Before addiction was a thing, it wasn't really a profession. It was just
Yeah.
so. I've helped them in CMEs. I don't know since probably '84. So it's way too long, but
Well, this
I'm
is
really.
great. I love you in this role. You're natural at it.
Well, you're always kind. Well, thank you, Dr. Siegel, for joining us and the gold standard. You're fantastic.
It's my absolute pleasure. and I'm indebted to you. I think you've helped me through my career. So any favor, anytime you want me to do anything, I'm going to say yes.